Well, it depends how we define rescue. I do not think in any way that Russia or China will become engaged directly into this war against with the United States. That being said, it's quite possible that they will supply weapons, drones. The Chinese have a lot of economic interests there. I assume that they will supply, but also the Russians. Keep in mind that the Americans have been fighting a proxy war against Russia using Ukraine for the past almost 12 years. So I do not doubt that the Russians would be prepared to essentially, reverse this and offer some kind of defense to Venezuela, not just to protect an ally, but perhaps to get back at the United States for the tens of thousands of lives which they have contributed to taking.
Right. Now, this is what is being speculated, that the Americans have anywhere from 180 to 190 of these Tomahawk missiles that the American president talks about. Do you think this particular campaign that the Americans have now started will remain limited to just airstrikes, or do you think the Americans could get involved in a much bigger way, probably land troops in Venezuela? Do you expect something on those lines to happen?
Well, it could happen, but I think this could become another Vietnam for the United States. So I think Trump's priority is to keep the American losses as low as possible, because once the Americans start coming home in coffins, then public opinion will turn on him very quickly. So I think Trump is essentially the president of low-hanging fruit. He would like to get a massive takeaway from minimal investment here. So I don't think they will go in with all the troops, but again, it is quite possible that this is simply the opening stage. But it could also be a warning that there is a possible development for the United States. Again, if this is a so-called bloody nose attack, it suggests that the U.S. will essentially punch Venezuela, and if Venezuela retaliates, then the full force of the United States will come in terms of troops. But as long as America is allowed to bomb Venezuela without Venezuela fighting back, then it might be low scale, put essentially Venezuela on the slow burner.
Indeed.
Yes, and that's extremely interesting, because when it comes to, because Saleh, you just mentioned the regional, countries such as China, Russia. We just knew that U.S. had this Operation Southern Spear along in Puerto Rico. So how does the regional, when it comes to Caribbean and countries like Puerto Rico, what kind of roles that these countries play? We've got a reaction from Petro calling for, reactions from UN. But what kind of reactions do you think we'll get from countries like Puerto Rico? Considering the fact that they just had these drills with the Puerto Rico, the U.S.
I'm not sure. I do think that I know that a lot of the neighboring countries will be quite appalled by this. As you mentioned, Colombia, for one, they have been, they used to be a very fierce rival of Venezuela. Of course, that was under a different president. But nobody in Latin America wants to see this. Even countries who do not care much for Maduro and who would like to see a different government in place, they know that this is not about Maduro. This is about the United States reasserting its hegemonic and imperial control over Latin America. So whether you're pro-American or anti or pro or against Maduro, none of this really matters. This is about the U.S. asserting its exclusive dominance in Venezuela. This will mean more military interventionism. It will mean lack in prosperity, because other trading partners such as China will now be shut out of the region if this continues. So again, I can't really make any predictions what smaller nations will do. But again, faced with the United States, I think many would also be cautious that they wouldn't also end up in the crosshairs of the Americans.
Professor, and also considering, the history that the United States has in South America, is this now Donald Trump's strategy that he wants to control and go back to what was Monroe Doctrine, where America would want to dominate the entire of the Western Hemisphere without the influx of any Chinese or Russian power projection of power there? Is this what Donald Trump is trying to do here, or is this just about oil that the Americans want to get their hands on from Venezuela?
Well, I don't think it's only oil. And again, the power projection of countries like China and Russia, I think it also applies to economic activity. The fact that the Chinese have become the largest trading partner. And this is what we saw in the new US national security strategy. They're recognizing now that the world has become multipolar, which means there's many centers of power, as opposed to the US having global primacy. Now, under this new environment, the Americans have to make some priorities. So they would like to shore up the Western Hemisphere to make sure that no other great powers are able to have a significant footprint there. Again, the original Monroe Doctrine, they wanted to avoid European imperial powers from having empires in America. So you can argue that this was anti-imperial, but this is very different. What the Chinese are doing or the Russians are doing in Latin America has nothing to do with imperialism. This is trade ties, allowing them to diversify. However, the US is now essentially citing the Monroe Doctrine to assert its own empire in global primacy or regional dominance in the Americas. So I think this is quite consistent with what America's been arguing, that is control over the Western Hemisphere, which means that the countries have to essentially obey Washington, and their natural resources should primarily be in the hands of the United States.